Hello and welcome everyone. In the next several podcasts, what we're going to talk about will include the scientific method, the cell theory, microscopy, and we're going to spend a little time talking about model organisms. We'll probably break this up into 2 or 3 podcasts so that each one stays around 20-25 minutes long. So let's go ahead and begin with our discussion of the scientific method. Now, I know you've had the scientific method probably since middle school or maybe even before that. But as we begin a science class, it's always good to kind of remind ourselves of some of the terms as we begin to learn new material and look at data. In applying the scientific method, there are several different ways that we could approach it. What we're going to do in this class is we're going to think about it from the first part of making observations. This includes looking at the experimental observations. This also will include looking at previously published data. We will then form what we call a null hypothesis. In general, we can think of the null hypothesis as the result if our prediction is wrong. The next thing is we will want to test the hypothesis. This includes designing the experiment and performing the experiment. Next, we will want to interpret the results. What do the results mean? Imply that we're going to use statistics, and then we always go back and design experiments. These experiments might be because our hypothesis was wrong, so we need to come up with a new hypothesis. Or perhaps the results suggest that our predictions were on target, and we may want to now design more experiments from a different angle with testing different variables to strengthen our hypothesis. And at some point, after you've designed other experiments, tested other hypotheses, you might come to a point where you can start building a theory. Often when we think of the word theory, the way that it's portrayed in popular media is that it's not a very strong piece of evidence. However, in science, when we say something is a theory, what we are saying is that there is very strong support from multiple disciplines, from multiple hypotheses, that our observations, our predictions are true. So theory is a very strong term we use in science. Popular media kind of makes it difficult for scientists to explain what theories are, but when we say theory, that means we're pretty sure what's happening is right on target. So, making observations. I want to pick an example that's from a different textbook, and it's not directly linked to cell biology, but maybe it could be by the time we get to the end. But it's talking about ants, and how ants find food, and then make it back. When an ant goes out, it may forage in multiple directions, looking for food. It has no real way here of having good directions to find the food. They certainly can sense food. There are certain smells that they might be attracted to, but until they get close to it, they do a lot of wandering. In fact, they may wander upwards of a distance of 100+ meters. Now, I might travel 100 meters for a good food, but you have to remember that this ant is only 1 centimeter, so it's really making a lot of distance. Now the interesting thing is that when that ant returns almost in a very straight line home, back to its nest. Except when it gets close to the nest, what we'll see is that there's a lot of back and forth motions until it actually finds the nest. But making it back home is a lot quicker. So that's one observation. Now scientists have seen this for a very long time, and they've tested different things, and they know that somehow the ants use the sun sort of as a compass. In general, they know where they're at. However, other experiments have shown that ants do not use landmarks. So a scientist by the name of Matthias Whitlinger, I'll just write the name over here, came up with an idea. So their prediction was that ants know the distance by leg movements. That is, they count steps somehow, and they combine that information with the angle of their steps. It seems a little far-fetched when you first think about it, but that was their prediction. So their null hypothesis, with that in mind, is that the stride length and step number should have no effect on ability to get back home to their nest. So right, return to the nest. All right, now they need to test this null hypothesis. And so what they did was they had these ants, a group of ants, and they allowed them to search for food that was 10 meters away. And the way they designed this experiment was that they couldn't really do too much meandering like we see in real life. They limited their ability to move around so that they could get an accurate distance here, which turned out to be about 10 meters. Once they reached the food here, they did one of three things to the ants. They would either do nothing to them, and we'll call this untreated. It's also our control, and allowed them to walk back. They then took some of the ants, and we'll call these stumps, because what they did with these ants is they cut their legs down, made their legs shorter, and allowed them to walk back. The third group we'll call stilts, because what they did here was they added length to their legs, and they allowed them to walk back. So as the ants were walking back, they would observe the ants to see when they started doing this searching for their nests at the very end, much like they would see here. Because remember, as they get closer to their nest, they would do this quick back and forth searching for that nest, but because they knew they were close. And what they found was in the untreated, the control, I'll just write 1 here, the distance they would travel before they started searching was about 10 meters, which was the distance that they traveled to begin with. The stumps, however, those with shorter legs, they would start searching between 5 and 7 meters. And lastly, the stilts. They might go 14 to 17 meters before they started searching. So let me just make a number here. 1, that's when they searched. 2 here, and then our stilts would search way over here past their nest. Next, the researchers needed to check the validity of their data. Maybe we had different lengths here, not because they were counting steps, not because they had some ability to measure the angle of their steps, but maybe it had to do with altering their legs. Maybe it had nothing at all to do with the actual prediction or the hypothesis. And so to test this, what they did was they took these 3 control animals here, they allowed them to settle for a while, and then they repeated the test. A little different this time though. They allowed the untreated to walk by themselves, and then the stumps to go by themselves, and then the stilts to go by themselves. They set up the same tube that was 10 meters long. They allowed the ants to go down this 10 meters to find the food, and then they allowed them to walk back. If the ants were really counting steps and somehow measuring the angle of their steps, when they return, they should all go the same 10 meters before they start searching for their nest again. They might do it at a different speed, but if they're really counting the steps, it doesn't matter if they have normal leg length, short legs, or long legs. And what they found was that all 3, 1 through 3, they all, when they returned home, they all took about 10 meters before they searched for their nests, suggesting that what they're really doing here is counting their steps and measuring the angle of their steps. So now that that first set of experiments have been completed, and they have more evidence suggesting that the ants are counting their steps and measuring the angles of their steps so they can get back to their nest more efficiently. The question then is, what's next? And ultimately what needs to happen is we'll need to test this hypothesis or develop new hypotheses related to that general question of how do ants get back to their nests. And so new hypotheses will be developed. They'll be tested. Other disciplines will test this hypothesis. We may find that there are questions that are more appropriate for an ecologist to approach. Maybe questions that are more appropriate for an evolutionary biologist. What's the evolutionary significance of this? Maybe questions for a geneticist to address. Maybe even chemistry, physics, and who knows, maybe even a cell biologist, which would be nice since this is a cell biology classroom. At some point, enough evidence comes about to support the hypothesis that the ants can count their steps and measure the angles of their steps to make a more efficient return to their nest. And at some point what will happen is these hypotheses will build up enough support so that we have a theory. And again, this theory is a very strong statement that our original ideas, having been modified and tested and retested and attacked from different disciplines and different angles, has a lot of support. So that's the goal. And we'll carry on this discussion in class. Now that we've talked about theories and how we build up support for theories, I want to talk about a very fundamental theory for this class, and that is the cell theory. So let's spend some time talking about the cell theory. Again, theories are the result of many hypothesis testings, of many different ideas from many different angles. So when we say the cell theory, again, we're saying with pretty strong conviction that the components of this cell theory are correct. So I'm going to write some of the tenets down of the cell theory, and your book oddly enough, for a cell biology book, doesn't really have a section called the cell theory. But I'm going to write some of these down for you. All living organisms are composed of cells. And we said this at the very beginning of class, of the semester. The cell is the basic unit of life. There's nothing smaller than the cell that still has the characteristics of life. So we say it's the basic unit of life. We can add to this. The third one I want to add here is all cells are produced by the division of pre-existing cells. So if you're looking at a petri dish with bacteria on it, and we see several colonies, we can look at each of these colonies, which contains billions of cells, and say they all came from one pre-existing cell. They have an ancestral history with one cell. All of the cells in this colony are related to each other because they came from the same ancestor. You could look at a multicellular organism, and again, don't be jealous of my mad drawing skills here, but remember, this organism here resulted from a single zygote. The trillions of cells in a human, I'll label this as a human just in case it wasn't clear what I was drawing there. All the cells in this human, the trillions of cells, came from this one zygote. Okay? So there's an ancestral history of every one of these trillions of cells with this early one zygote. The fourth thing I want to say about the cell theory is that all cells have a similar basic chemistry. The metabolic pathways that occur in yeast, a single-cell organism, or in bacteria are the same that happens in humans. Glycolysis is glycolysis. It doesn't change much. So we all have a very similar basic chemistry. All right, that's all I want to say about the cell theory. Okay, now that brings us to our summary and the end of this first podcast. Most of this podcast focused on the scientific method. We talked about how we approach this, how we start from some observations and how we build a hypothesis, and then how we test that hypothesis, and then how we retest it and develop new questions, and how ultimately it ends in a very well-tested theory. And then we spent the last part here talking about an important theory for cell biology called the cell theory. In class, we're going to build from these, mainly more than likely using the ant as a model, and build that into some cell biology and how we take steps and think about science from a cell biology perspective. Remember that ant stuff. So we'll go from ant to cell biology. Okay, that's all I have. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you come see me, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. I'll see you later. Bye.